Welcome to the Next Chapter webinar series, powered by and brought to you by Contractor Academy. I'm Bill Kennard with Grandy & Associates.
And I'm Glenn Herman with Creative Business Services.
Awesome. Glenn, it's good to be back here with you again.
Likewise. And I got to say, before we start, something about, you're looking good today.
Hey, what can I say?
Totally unplanned.
Glad you sent the memo. Okay, so we had a chuckle a little bit when Glenn walked in the door here today, and we look like twins. So we're going to jump in today and start to focus on it. And really what we're, again, in this series, we're looking at preparing your business for the next chapter, looking at handing off that baton and really successfully making the transition to the next generation. So one of the things that's helpful, again, is just for anybody who hasn't been in the previous sessions, is just to recap real quickly there's really three different avenues or paths that people are taking, right? We start out with, there's some that are in the path of really truly succession planning, right? Where we're planning that succession process and handing off the baton to somebody else who's in the company. I'm looking to select that next person, that successor. There's transition, right? We already have we know who the next person is going to be. We just need to help facilitate that process. And then there's exit strategy, where I just want you to give me a truckload of money and I'll give you the keys and we'll go away happy, right? And there's a lot of common areas between those three, aren't there, Glenn?
Absolutely. And they all focus, and we'll talk about it later as we go on today. So much of it surrounds the process and the timing.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I had the opportunity to, I taught 3 different succession planning programs here over the last couple of weeks. And again, the common questions, the common threads that were in there, again, the surprise when we started looking at you talked about the process, and you've talked about that a little bit in the past, Glenn, about really how important that is in the thought of handing off the baton.
Establishing process, but having a process for the transition well in advance. Having an understanding of not only what is the business worth, but the timing. Are we ready?
So you're actually saying 2 different processes. One, a process for the transition itself, correct, which is certainly where you come into the puzzle, because you are working with that all the time. We're kind of prepping for that in that process on our side. The second processes that are critical is the processes inside the company.
Very critical. Because that's a determination oftentimes of value.
And that was where the surprise came in for a lot, is that really, that part of it's important. I ask at the end of every program, I'll ask the question, what was your big takeaway out of the entire class that we did? And several brought that up, that the need for establishing processes within my company has any kind of a bearing or effect on the overall value of the company. And so that's an important piece. Yeah.
Think of it as in terms of an investor, or even in transition with somebody that you already know, a successor inside the family or inside the company that is going to take over. Having that ability for them to work on the business instead of in the business developing processes, it's critical.
Oh, absolutely.
Makes it more valuable.
Yeah, I agree. So just as a real quick recap.
I don't think his mic is fully plugged
in. Actually, if you could, so we got a tiny technical issue. There should be a small adapter laying around there. If you see that one there. Yep. Okay. Throw that one in there, Glenn. All right. The joys of live broadcasting here. So we apologize for that one. So we want to just, again, just in the previous sessions, we actually talked about 10 action steps that we want to go through as we go through the succession process. And so we've got these 10 laid out. We've already covered a couple of them in previous sessions. We'll actually jump through, we're going to get into a couple more here and certainly more coming up ahead. And then we also laid out really a 3-year and a 5-year timeline that you want to look at. Now, again, so Stacy's going to share these certainly in the chat box. So if you're attending live in this session, you can just go ahead and double-click on that in the chat box and download those. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, at that point, just certainly shoot us a note. and we will get those over to you. So, and again, just the quick reminder that the items that are on these timelines, that's not when you start working on those items, right? That's really the latest that you should be working on them.
Yeah, it should really be and I've said this in previous webinars, having a plan for your business exit at the onset is sometimes a very good idea. In most cases, knowing how you're going to exit your business, even if it's 20 years down the line, knowing what either that time is so that you can plan, but also knowing there might be some triggers there that say, I'm going to sell my business now. Yep. Having that understanding early.
When you say now, when we meet this criteria, we get to this point, that's when I'm going to sell the business. It is valuable, I think, because certainly, again, if again, start with the end in mind, right? What is it going to look like? It was fun, actually. I was really pleasantly surprised to see the number of people who were planning still 20 years down the road as retirement for them in these classes that we did this last week. So that was interesting. So let's jump into a couple of those different things. Really, the focus today is going to be, the business side of your business. Right, and the question being, where is your business now in its stages of growth and development, right? And part of it is you need to know where you are before you can take that next step. And really is just as at a 30,000-foot view, Glenn, is the number side of my business that important if I'm selling the company?
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is. And, we talk about realities, and I touched on this in a conversation earlier. There's an internal reality and an external reality. Internal reality is what, hey, I feel like I'm ready for this. And external reality is what is really the case. And the only way you really get to that is through the numbers, through the financials, through the valuation. So am I where I need to be? Is that trigger met? Has that trigger been met?
Because one of the challenges, right, is if you're not profitable as a company, number one, who wants to buy a losing venture?
Right.
Yeah. But number two, even if they do want to buy it, odds are it's going to be a fire sale. Right? I think I mentioned it last month, right? In that a particular contractor that we work with is looking at growing their company, and they're targeting growth through acquisition. And the companies they're looking for are companies that are owned by somebody in their mid-50s or later that are losing money.
Right.
Because really, think about it. What are they buying at that point?
Well, and why are they losing money? In most cases, what I've found, the reason they're losing money is because there isn't a process there. And that's what those type of sharks are looking for. They're looking for a company that they can go take a 2 mile, above that business, look down 2 miles and say, okay, here are the things that are happening and not happening in this business. Here are our strengths. Do they fit the weaknesses there? Can we bring that part of that business up and elevate it to the point where we can make it profitable?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, and process.
And install the processes in there, and think about it. What did they just ultimately receive? Right? They just bought, chances are, more geographical territory. They bought more customers. They bought more people or employees, and especially if they're good, right? Which are so hard to find today. And so, and they got it for a steal.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's really what we're looking at there. So the two questions, every week, every month, we've challenged you with two questions that you really need to answer. And so the first one of those is my business healthy enough to meet my timeline succession plan? Going back all the way back in December, I think the very first one, we asked them, you have to have, and it goes along with what you said a minute ago, what is that date? You have to have an idea when you're looking for it. And I don't care if that's 20 years from now. But what is that date? And so the question is your business healthy enough to meet that timeline? And again, maybe the timeline, right, Glenn, that I look at is I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm worn out. I don't have the passion anymore. My timeline is, quite frankly, if you made me an offer today, I'll hand you the keys. What's the problem with that?
Well, value is going to be oftentimes predicated on passion. With the passion, there's a relationship there. When the passion starts to drop, buyers sense that, and that's blood in the water for a shark. If they sense that, and that's where having a third party, that's where we oftentimes find ourselves creating success because we're able to mitigate that to an extent. But at the end of the day, it becomes apparent if somebody's just really burnt out. And that's why that timeline is so important. And to your point, if it's 20 years down the road, great. The sooner you plan for that 3 or 5 year timeline, there may be a situation where you say, we want to be ready to do this in 5 years. Well, if you can get ahead of the curve and you're ready to sell in 3 years, and in year 4, that market, like the current market environment right now is fantastic. There's always an inverse relationship between interest rates and values. So interest rates are still relatively low, although we see them going up. Values are higher than they've been. Access to capital is very good. And so there's money out there. All those things kind of come into play, but the timing, if that happened in year 4, but you were ready in year 3, and you weren't really planning on year 5, but maybe it's a good time now, and there's some opportunity. Maybe
you take advantage.
Maybe you take advantage of the opportunity.
Sure. Makes sense. So that's the first one. The second one is the sustainability. Is your business financial model sustainable for your exit and the business's success? So depending on the size of the company, that can be an issue, right? I mean, if as the owner, if you're going to leave and just take all the cash with you, there might be some considerations that we need to have, and they're again depending on the size of the company.
And again, the larger companies, there's an argument. Some people say 5 million, some people say 7 million. It depends on the buyer as well, but you may have to leave a little cash in the business so that there's operating capital for the successor to be able to start off with.
And let me ask this: I mean, if it were more of a, let's say, the family transition, right? One of the kids are taking it, or one of my employees, or something like that, and it's substantially smaller than 5 million. Right. There still may be a need at that point because sometimes that next generation really doesn't have any extra cash.
And again, kind of like I would say, it's what kind of capital is being brought to the table by the buyer. So if this is a family endeavor, and at that point, one of the chief goals is to have that business succeed. And if there's cash in the business, it's more likely to succeed because they can take advantage of things like, maybe there's a discount on early payment, or maybe there's a bulk buy, or whatever. There might be some opportunities for that.
Which ultimately help profitability.
Right. And it helps profitability. It's a little wiggle room, allows people to work on the business and in the business a little bit. So. Yeah, there's some definite advantages.
So those are the questions. Now, I think one of the challenges, now, Glenn, you haven't necessarily seen this before, but, for those of you who have been in some of my workshops in the past, you've heard me kind of run through this. Sometimes the problem with, really understanding the business side of the business comes from where we came from as contractors, right? Because chances are, and we work with a lot of contractors, all trades, and we hear the same thing over and over again. And that's that basically, 95% of contractors got their start the same way. Right? They started out working in the field as a technician or installer for somebody else. And they're working on a job one day, probably, in the hole or in the crawl space or the attic space, and it's 140 degrees and the sweat and the spiders are going down the back, and I'm not having any fun, and the light bulb goes on and it's going, wait a minute. I'm getting paid 10, 15, 20 bucks, 25, but whatever the number is, it doesn't matter because I'm the one doing all the work, the boss is getting rich. And I don't like this deal, right? I mean, I could go out and do this on my own because we all know it's not hard to run a contracting company. All you got to be willing to do is tell other people what to do and sit back and collect lots and lots of money. Right? It's not hard to do this. And so, I'm going to go into business for myself. And we find out pretty quickly that maybe it's not as easy as I thought it was. That maybe there's not quite as much profitability in this thing as I thought it was. And so, we start to struggle with that, and now we start, get a little bit behind. And since we're working in the field, we're doers, which is a bit of a challenge for a business owner, right? Because what's the problem if you're doing?
Yeah, you're working in it.
You're working in it.
And you're not working on it.
Right? It's tough to grow it. Right, as that's kind of the old adage of building the airplane while you're flying it, right? And sometimes if you don't have any wheels, it's tough to get off the ground at that point, as I say. So that starts to create a little bit of that problem when we get in there, and so we're too busy in the middle of our business working in it. We're too busy losing money to stop and figure out why, and so that starts to create a little bit of this problem with the financial side of the puzzle. Now, Yeah, I wanted to share this with you, Glenn, because so in the class that I do, one of the things that we do is we do a brainstorming session. And like I said, I've done 3 of them in the last 3 weeks. And I kept this slide from the last class. And so what we did is literally the group breaks out into a separate little session, and they do a brainstorming session. And around key areas, I ask them, when it comes to the succession or the transition or the exit process of your company, what are your concerns when it comes to the health of the company? And these were their responses. This did not come from us. These are their responses. And so the responses were basically this. Some of them. I'll start at the top and kind of go down. What happens to the relationship with relationship business? So again, I'm not quite clear on that one. One of the other ones here, were the only concern would be being able to get new employees as the company grows to the next level and or when the employees retire. If we can't get qualified people, we will remain the same size and not be able to grow when the business needs us to. You had a thought or two on that one, as far as finding those people and getting, what's the challenge there with employees retiring?
It's kind of some time back. I talked to an Amish gentleman, and he said, I asked him. I said, well, because they were buying a horse, and I'm interested in other cultures, and I said, well, what do you do when you have a new horse, like a new young horse? You put them with you.
Because typically the horses are paired.
Yeah,
right?
and I thought, I'm a hunting guy, so I when I get a new dog, I train him with my old dog a little bit, But he said, well, you don't want to put it with the oldest horse. You want to kind of pair it with an experienced, kind of middle-aged younger horse. And I think businesses in the contracting world are you have to really pair people correctly in order to have that longevity. And when you get qualified people in your organization, you have to pair them with those seasoned folks, but they have to be properly paired. You wouldn't want 2 real social butterflies necessarily together because...
Yeah, but they get along really well together.
But they also give away the store. and that's the problem.
And they get along really well, right? So all they do is talk all day and don't get anything done.
One guy works, 2 guys talk, 3 guys party, right? That's pretty typical. But.
No comments, Stacy. I can see Stacy, our producer, already getting comments about you and I here, right? So kind of mentoring that next person, because that is a challenge, right? Especially today, it's not like there's a killer replacement that you're going to have coming into your company.
I think if I'm looking at a contracting company and there's a mentoring program in place that's kind of predicated on the use of personality profiling, like we talked about,
last month. Yeah.
Last month, when we have those type of situations as a buyer, I'm looking and going, wow. That's next level thought. There's value there because it's not just a human resources plan. It goes beyond that. It's a growth plan individually for the individual employee and with younger employees, millennials and Gen Z and whatever else we're calling them. With those folks, they're very experiential, and a lot of times. They feel a huge benefit in being mentored.
Sure.
Somebody that they can reach out to. And I mean, I've benefited personally from mentor-protege relationships in my career on both sides of the fence, whether it be as a protege or a mentor.
Yep.
And they're both equally valuable. And with an older employee or a more seasoned employee, more experienced employee, that adds a lot of value to their job satisfaction too.
So, okay, I'm going to go back to the horses, right? For a minute. And here's the reason why, right? Because you said there's value to pairing them with an older individual, and I agree. But I think we need to, again, find the right individual, right? I go back to when I was in school, right? And I think this pairs right along with the horses, right? Because sometimes that old horse does things that you don't necessarily want to replicate.
Right.
Right? And I remember when I was going to school, right, so eons ago, I did a work internship at a paper mill here in Green Bay, and I was working with the electricians, and the older gentleman that I was paired with, he was the senior electrician in the mill, and so quite frankly, I had an easy job because we would be on break somewhere in the mill, and he'd go, "Oh, come on, kid. We got to get going. Our regular break is scheduled for 15 minutes. We got to get across the mill to the break room." I'm going, wait a minute, I just thought we were on break. Well, this guy mastered the art of taking breaks, right? I mean, so he just find the break room where nobody was looking, right? And he taught me all kinds of bad habits like that, right? And that's kind of the thing you're talking about with pairing it with the right person, right?
Absolutely. And while they're, those folks, we do have, every company has, typically when you get to a certain size, is going to have those masters of the break.
Yep.
But identifying that's not your mentor. Having the right, you can have, age doesn't really mean as much as attitude, but consider the person. If you have a personality profile and you see somebody that's maybe an emerging leader, that's a great opportunity for them to shine as an emerging leader, and for you to look at their performance in that role as mentor, if it's structured correctly, to see, is this really the person? Are they an emergent leader? And how does that new person, how do they reflect the values of that mentor?
Sure.
And very important to
Absolutely.
watch.
So, interesting, that came up when we were talking about the business side of the business, and so I thought that was good, right? The concern, they had a concern they wanted to be able to continue to grow, a concern of adapting to ever-changing conditions consistently, right? So that was another one that came up. This one here, I thought was interesting. The concern was, will the profitability of the business remain? And will the company be able to hire employees and replace those retiring to be able to retain their reputation that this company has built over 55 years? So kind of that same thing, right? So that wasn't quite the one I was thinking it was, but again, do you have a mentoring program in your company? And again, that needs to be, as you said, well before, right? That's a process. The business, a concern another business owner had is our business has grown 25% year over year for the last 5 years. Kudos to you, right? And is on pace to grow another 25% this year. As we grow, we've placed a premium on operational efficiency and eliminating negative plays. That screams process again, doesn't it?
25% growth, unless you were making, very little net income. If your net is really low, then 25% isn't necessarily great. But
25% of a buck is still 25 cents.
I can tell this is a company that's really hitting on all cylinders, and you can't do that without process.
Right.
Question in the chat. Can you see the chat or the Q&A?
No. Hang on one second. Let me just get the Q&A up here real quick. We've got a question that was coming in, and so we want to use those. So again, if you got questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A side, all right, so is there a written manual available that has all the written processes and procedures that a contracting firm should follow? Do you have a thought on that one first?
Well, I would say they should talk to you, because that's something that you're pretty good at. There should be. There should be for each company, but they're individual.
Right. So here's the direct answer to that question, Brent, is no. Because every company is a little bit different. The way that you do things, the culture in your company, the way that you provide a level of customer service in your company is unique to you. That's part of the value that why somebody should call you, right? Again, I can go into your community and I can pull out Mr. Google here real quick and I can find a dozen more just like you. The question is, why should I call you? And the way that you write that, the way that you come to the table with that piece of the puzzle is unique to your company, and that is part of the value of your company. Now, having said that, again, there are absolutely general guidelines that we could follow, but there's not going to be a solid template that, here's what you need to install in your
and
company.
I misunderstood. Is there a book? There should be a book in each company.
Right.
Each company should not only have processes, we all have processes for doing something. Maybe for an HVAC or electrical contractor, you have a plan at the end of the day for somebody to prep for the following day, so your guys aren't sitting around waiting. And having that process, we all have them, but document them.
Right. And so that's what I think Brent was asking, is that something available that I can just get my hands on and install in the company? And that's the answer to that is no. But you need to develop those. And we actually have a comment coming up on that. By gosh, it's the next one, right? Having the time to write down those processes. And that's a challenge. Now, again, it's not something you're going to sit down and write out today, right? We're going to write that book here today over the next 3 weeks. It doesn't happen that way. But maybe you take, one element, right? So we go on a service call. What's the process that we use to greet the customer, right? And just lay out the service call, and that's it, right? And then you go back to running your business, right? And then next week we're gonna hit one more step, right? And it may take a couple of years, but that's why this becomes so important.
Well, and looking at when you look at your financials, you look at your P&L statement every month. That's why it's so important to look at those financials every month, because you're going to see areas that scream something needs to be changed here, and that's a good place to focus. I think you're right on. Where does the money come from? It comes from our customers. So that naturally, that should be one of your first orders of business.
Yep.
I would argue understand your financials and where your money is coming from. Where your money is coming from and where it's going are the two most important things in any business, obviously. But having that that focus on process with the customer, if you do it consistently every time, if you're an HVAC contractor, you come in, you greet the customer the same way. I used to run an HVAC electrical and plumbing company, and put your boots on before you come in. Put your shoe covers on. Walk in the house. Okay, now we have a very specific thing. How much time do we have today? So you're respectful of people's time, and have an order of march in your process. The consistency of process in sales or in customer contact is critical, because that consistency, when you have consistency, you can do what's called A/B testing. You can modify a little bit. You can change the color of the ink in your pen. Sounds silly, but I've seen salespeople that have worked for me use red pens. Don't do that. Red is a pain color. That's the first things that were circled on all my papers. And well, that's not my first papers, and a lot of them after that by the teacher. When we got our tests back, we're in red. That's a bad negative. And it's little things like that. And you can, tweak your system, and that's where you can eke out opportunity. But you have to have that process established.
Right. No doubt. So Jennifer, I see your question there. Hang with me just 1 second. We will get to that one. One of the other ones that are here, and I think, the change, and we'll hit these a little bit quicker because I want to get to some of the other items, right? But the concern was that changing the dynamic will change the success and the steady growth that we've had. And that one, right? When we read that earlier, the first comment you said was, "Well, that's culture."
100%. Yeah.
And what are the odds the culture in the company is going to change if the leader changes?
100%.
I agree.
It's
right?
going to
it's
change.
going to change.
Yeah,
right? And so it's a matter of, again, how long is that process taking? How smoothly are we handing off that baton? The second half of that our contractors will not respond the same way to a new company leader or a new company head. Also trying to take what my dad does now and continue to do that, but also be able to make it my own. And that's culture, isn't it?
It's culture, and it's understanding the personalities, having an understanding of those individual personalities in leadership and how they work together with each other. And that can be done in advance. That's why the timeline is important. If you have those established, that can be flushed out well in advance of an actual transition. And you're going to be able to get feedback from existing employees that are interacting with your leaders. And it's important to have an open culture where people feel comfortable coming back and talking about, hey, well, this didn't work for me, and this did. That's very important.
So well, let's hit this last one real quick, right? Because the last comment that was here was, I think the health of the business is important, but it'll be on the successor to maintain, change, or make it better. So the current health of the is important, but it's not vital. Again, from that, the buying and selling perspective,
the health of the business is going to largely determine the value of the business in terms of goodwill. Unless, depending on the valuation method, we'll talk about valuations in depth next month. But depending on how the valuation is what we look at, it's the goodwill aspect that really is affected by that. I would argue it's critical. I think it's not only important, I think it's critical. And unless you're looking at fire sale, If it's a, hey, I have to get out of here, there's a health reason or whatever, then let's make the business as attractive as we can, find all the high points, and go to market with the high points.
So, and just that word real quick, because it definitely goes back to, the financials of the company affect, you said goodwill.
Sure.
And again, like you said, we'll talk about valuation. That's going to be the entire topic of next month's webinar. But goodwill that's one of those soft things.
It is.
That adds value to the company that you can't necessarily find on the profit and loss statement.
Absolutely. I'm working with an HVAC company, and they have a lot of NATE certified technicians. And, that's like the gold standard of HVAC.
Yep.
Having that increases the value for any outside company because, number one, labor pool.
Right.
Human capital is one of the most, and we all know that. Everybody's seems to be, regardless of with whom I speak,
right.
we have the same problems. Finding people, good people, but even warm bodies is becoming difficult in some areas. So I think that's very critical to have that as part of your consideration in terms of goodwill. What's the labor pool? What's the geographic? Is there a geographic market? Is your market geographically tied up by? How do you say? Do you have more market share than somebody's going to be able to come in and compete?
Right.
Is there a barrier to entry? Is there a barrier to entry with population? It could be income. If you're in a specific area, high income zip code, and you own that high income zip code, or you own a neighborhood, that was one of the things that I really focused on when I was in the contracting businesses, and I actually developed an app around it and some things. But talking about owning neighborhoods, you have a neighbor at XYZ, XYZ Street, and how do I own that street? Well, how do I market to it? It's all about process. So all considerations, when you have those kind of things, it's all about goodwill. It's all things that aren't going to necessarily show up in the financials.
Yep.
I mean, they will ultimately, but it's more than that.
Right.
It's culture. Culture is good. If you have a strong culture of continuous improvement, we saw 25% growth for the last 5 years. There's continuous improvement there. There's empowered employees there.
Sure.
There's
Absolutely.
people, everybody's taking a leadership role.
And again, those are all those little soft things that you can't find on a financial. So the question that Jennifer had was, how do you start the succession planning process, and what would be the first few steps? So, so Jennifer was second generation and looking to pass that, to ultimately take the baton. I think one of the things there that I would do is go back to those 10 action steps.
Sure.
Right, and that timeline, because the first starting elements of that, Jennifer, are going to be, again, looking at defining a couple of items, but then understanding, starting to, do we have a solid understanding of the financial side of the business? Do we know where that's at? We're going to talk about a couple of other items here in just a little bit, in terms of the business plan and some of those, but certainly, when we look at those action steps that you see, looking at the financial and timing piece of the puzzle, certainly, delegation practices, is that being practiced within the company? Now, I know you're second generation or the next generation, but again, we need to be, the current leaders need to be training the rest of the team to be thinking like we did. And I don't know if you had an opportunity, Jennifer, to catch last month's. If not, in the follow-up email that will go out today, we will have the link where you can go back and view every one of the previous ones. And literally, those are the items that I would recommend that you go back and start with at that piece. And if you want to have a more focused discussion, we can certainly do that as we, after the webinar today. So one of the elements that we come up with on the business side of it is that the current owner, right, says they do so much by gut feel, and the problem is, can you teach gut feel? And we had a little bit of this discussion earlier,
and you kind of, I think it's difficult to teach, but you have to teach it at some level. But it's difficult because it comes from experience. It comes from taking your lumps.
Yeah. I mean, think about, so if you are that leader right now, one of the challenges is, how do you teach it? Right? How did you learn the gut feel? Right? Odds are, like you said, you took lumps at some point, Ed. Sometime way back, we did, a project and we missed something, or we did something wrong and we lost our tail on it. And, so we put some kind of policy or practice in place so that didn't happen again. Well, when you do that policy long enough, well, then pretty soon it becomes a habit, and you do a habit long enough and you don't even think about it. It's just ingrained in you. The problem is it took you 30 years to get to that point.
Yeah.
You don't have 30 years to teach the next generation. Mm-hmm. And so how do you go back and teach some of those ultimate basics that are there?
Right.
And that's a challenge. So as a leader, you need to think through that. And one of the things that I encourage you to do is work with the next generation on that. Mm-hmm. So we're in the process. We're actually, because we've had a number of requests, we're writing a whole series on basic HVAC electricity. Well, I've been doing basic HVAC electricity for 38 years. And so to try and write out those basics of where does electricity come from and how does it work and how does the contactor work and how does the motor work and what does the capacitor do and all those things, I haven't thought about that in 30 years, right? And so I'll write it out, and then I'll have people on my team who have no HVAC or electricity experience go through it. And unfortunately, it kills me every time, Glenn. We get to about the second or third line, and they're going, I have no clue what you're telling me. Right? That tells me that you've got to get simpler, right? So you need to kind of focus on that piece of the puzzle. And then we come again, really back to, we've said it several times, right? That process, defining the process, because that process ultimately affects the numbers of the company, all the way through there, right? And so, defining everything, right? So when A happens, we do B every time. When A happens, we do B, right? So you said it a little bit earlier as far as, we go to the customer's house, right? First thing we do is put on the shoe covers. The first, and what is that process that we're going to follow as we go through that? But it's one thing to have the process. It's another one to actually enforce it.
And that can, you can do that certainly with customer satisfaction. You can do that with follow-up, and you only can expect what you inspect. So
I love that phrase.
if you don't follow up and check, and the frequency changes, the frequency changes over time. If you keep hitting 100%, my sampling plan of checking you out is going to be reduced.
Sure.
So now I'm going to check you once every month or once every
instead
quarter.
of once a week or something like that.
Instead of once a week.
And it was interesting. Sometimes this checking isn't that difficult. I was working with a contractor at one point, and that was one of their policies. And they marketed the fact that they wore shoe covers all the time. Yeah. Right. And I remember, visiting them once a week for about 8 weeks. And they had and they'd always tell their guys, make sure you have plenty of shoe covers, the inventory of them sitting over on the shelf there. And I'd watch that shelf, and after 6 weeks, I'm going, why do you keep lying to your customers? He goes, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you said that you wear shoe covers. I said, those boxes of shoe covers have not moved, and the level has not gone down in 6 weeks. You can't tell me your guys are wearing shoe covers. Right? So that's one of those pieces that fall in. And then again, that oversight, right? Expect what you inspect. Right, or inspect what you expect, I guess, and then the delegation piece. So I'm going to jump forward here, right? So the specific business tools that you have to have in place, and Jennifer, this goes back to certainly your question a little bit as well, is what are some of those minimum requirements? And so the first one I want to talk about is a business plan. Right? Really, right? I've always said you need to have a business plan in place, regardless of the size of the company, right? I don't care if you're $250,000 or if you're $250 million. Right? There needs to be a business plan in place, and would you agree with that?
100%. I think you have to have. I think it's a type of business plan that you have, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I think it's important to have because just like setting goals, your business plan kind of encompasses what your expectations are in advance. So, while it's not a goal specifically, there's an expectation that you've set for your business.
Yep.
It's a, with the exception of executive summary, which we'll talk about, which is more of an overview, it really does help bring the plan together.
Sure.
It develops the expectations. It forms that purpose, that motivation, that direction, all those things that a leader needs to do. Get focused in on that business plan.
And this old, the old adage here, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. The problem is you just never know when you've arrived. Right? It's so true, right? So many companies, especially in the trades industry, don't grow. They simply evolve, right? I mean, we got into a new segment of business simply because the phone rang, right? And somewhere along the line, right, you had this conversation. It's, yep, we can do that. Sure, we can do that. Yeah. How the heck are we going to do that, right? You know, we run into, you know, and then all of a sudden you're wandering into areas of business that maybe don't make any sense.
Right.
Now, what do you think, Glenn, about, so I always recommend, right, is this piece of the puzzle, you know, it can, even if you have a business plan today, a business plan, first off, is a living document, so it should be updated regularly, but go through and create it with the next generation, right? Or if you are the second generation, you know, asked to, you know, put it together with the current leaders of the company.
Sure. What a great way to transition. This is the planning that we're talking about. That's a great way to transition the culture now, without even starting it. You're already setting the stage for success for that next generation.
Right. And we get both generations now on the same page, so we're heading in the same direction. We're heading, you know, doing the same thing. And again, you know, it's think of that relay race and handing off the baton, right? If we can't slow down the momentum of the company while we're doing it, but you know, we need to. It just does a really nice job of getting both people on the same page.
Right. And you know, I know there may be some disagreement, but the current generation may not know everything. That's the other side of it.
Really? I mean,
it's possible that there could be some good ideas out there we don't know about.
You know, and I do find that interesting because after our 2-day business workshops, a lot of times we'll ask, okay, you know, what surprised you about what you learned in this process, and what are you going to do when you get home? And it's interesting because a lot of times we'll have two generations there, and you know, son or daughter will go, man, I knew mom or dad did a boatload of stuff here in this company. I just didn't have a clue, right? And mom or dad are going, well, you know what? I think Junior's got some good ideas. I think we need to start, right? And suddenly we just did the same thing.
And we see that when we're selling businesses that are owned currently by two generations that want to exit. One of the questions I always ask when I'm selling a business is, what would you do different or better? Because, you know, that's the basis for potentially a pro forma that we can create for a potential prospective buyer. And it's amazing the comments that can come out of that are just amazing. You know, and you'll have the older generation look over and say, wow, I never even considered that.
Sure.
Well, you guys are here every day.
Right.
I wish you would have done that sooner.
Yeah. Now you just use the term a pro forma.
A pro forma is kind of it's a futurist. It's like creating a scenario where something, if you did this, if we added this, that, or the other, we would see a growth over time of this amount.
So it's kind of a financial projection.
A projection of sorts,
you know,
sure.
if you will, if we had done something
Correct.
different, right?
Correct.
Kind of a what-if scenario. This is what's possible.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So, you know, really that business plan is designed to set the direction of the company, right? Where are we going? What's our focus? How are we going to get there? You know, what kind of detailing in some cases, at least taking into account what it's going to take to get there, right? If we're going to grow, are we going to need more people, right, in different positions? What about equipment, right? What are we going to need there? You know, what about, do we need, you know, potentially for funding or cash flow or some of those other items? So let's just kind of jump in there a little bit, right? So when it comes to a business plan, right, and I did a program just a couple of weeks ago on writing the business plan. This, you know, the number one comment that I hear is, this is really daunting, right? I mean, because you know, I've seen business plans, right? And they're this 247-page thesis, or, you know, I do a quick Google online, ask, you know, about, you know, a business plan format, and there's all this stuff, you know, the first executive summary. I mean, what's needed with the business plan, Glenn?
My personal opinion, it has to be something that you use. If you don't use it, if it's an executive summary, it's more for a bank, I'm buying a business kind of thing. That's a little different story. You're likely to have, if you have an internal versus an external buyer, that can change things up as well. At the end of the day, a business plan should really be focused, in my opinion, on activity. Activity that you can not only understand, but that you can measure. If you can't measure it, you can't create a process to improve it. So I think that's critical. When we talk about the different types, you could almost look at the next four beyond executive summary, a financial plan, marketing plan, production needs, and organizational plan. There's elements of each of those that should be considered in any business plan. And so it's more of how you shape the look of the business plan, but at the end of the day, it has to really be, a business plan is really a path towards future growth. It's a structure. It's a structuring of growth on the front side, because you'll be able to see, hey, this is what we, business plan tells you this is what we need to do to succeed to this level, or whatever.
I'm $1.5 million now. I want to be $3 million in 5 years. How are we going to get there? Right. And if we're going to do that, well, again, how many more people do I think I might need to hire to, and it's not just field guys, right? Do I need a salesperson? Do I need, what does that look like within your company? And how long does this thing have to be? Let's break it down, because I think you made a very good point, I think, in that depending on the company, if it's an internal transition.
Correct.
I've got somebody, there's a current employee, there's a family member that we're going to transition. Has one look and feel. Sure. Right?
I think if you're looking at an internal situation, you're looking largely at the activity or the activity of the individual within the company by each particular department. That's one of the things that you could look at. Activity is so important because you can create process around it. When we're looking at, for instance, financial. If we're looking at financial, that can be a structure for growth, because we can say, when we hit this benchmark, we're hiring a salesperson.
Yep.
Or if we hit this many hours of having to work, I'm hiring an assistant. That was one for me in the past, was, okay, now I need a second assistant when I get to this level, because I knew when I got here I have to hire an assistant. When I get to the next level, I have to hire a second person, or I have to find one person that can do both jobs, which may be the case.
Or let's take it down to a little bit different level. When I hit X number of hours of overtime for X number of weeks, I'm going to hire another field guy.
Correct.
Right. That would be, some of those things. That's kind of that piece that's there. It doesn't need to be, this massive document. It's looking at each area of your company and how are you going to grow and what are you going to do with it. Now, if I'm looking for an outside buyer, does that business plan change at all?
It typically does. If you're looking for an outside buyer, you're going to have more competition focus typically. You're going to have what we call SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're going to outline those in detail, simply because a prospective buyer is going to want to say, well, what's your question you might have is, what's the business plan? And once they're vetted to a certain point, that might be something that we discuss. This is the mission side of what we do. It's not so much the vision, the pie in the sky stuff, but you're going to have a little bit of a different flavor, because the internal processes are for the internal potential.
Sure.
They're for your internal folks. So the business plan for an external buyer likely is going to focus more on competition analysis, financials. There's going to be a large component of the financials in there.
So in that case, the financial plan, executive summary, really a history of the company, where we are, how did we get here, what were those things that we did over the years that were really knocked out of the ballpark, what are the things that we did that we have been trying to forget about, but what did we learn from them, right? Those kinds of things. Financial plan, right? Not only P&L, history of that, but also the balance sheet.
Balance sheet,
right?
Sure.
Maybe a cash flow.
Cash flow statement's going to be key in there. It's going to be very important for the current owner to understand the financials, though. That is critical.
Right.
If they don't understand it and can't answer questions quickly, that's a concern.
Right, because if somebody asks a question and, well, I'm not quite sure, right, then that also is an indication of how well you know your numbers, right?
Right.
No doubt. Okay, good. So again, the business plan doesn't have to be that complex. Now, one of the things we will do is we do have a summary, a sample business plan. Stacy will share that in the chat box for you. So if you go to the chat, you can grab it there. We have, again, it's just a sample that you can use. You don't need all elements of it. Right, again, kind of take what Glenn just mentioned. If it's internal, it's going to be focused more on processes in the company and how you do things, how are you going to grow. External, well, then we need a little bit more that goes around that one. So think about those couple of items. Now, there's a number of other tools on the financial side that are absolutely critical, right? So you said they need to understand the financials.
Absolutely.
Right. So tell me, let's start at the top here, the profit and loss statement. Really, what are we looking for there?
The last line What does that say? The last line and the last number. We're going to look at profit and loss statement. I think we all know we're looking at our revenue less our expenses and what's our income. At the end of the day, that's kind of the main number that we're looking at for ourselves, but not necessarily what we're looking at if we're an external buyer. If we're an internal buyer, we want to have an understanding of that because that's going to dictate what processes and activities may have to change as we transition. But for an external buyer, when we're looking at, they may be looking at things like cost of goods sold. Maybe they have a better mousetrap or a better buying power or,
and they see that your cost of goods sold are, 45% of your total revenues.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of a red flag.
Right.
That's right. There's something not quite right in here.
Right. It could be as simple as a cost of goods sold, or it could be expenses. What's our expense ratio? What are those ratios against revenue when we're talking about things like, we can talk about contribution margin and get into the, we can kind of get into the weeds a little bit, but when we're looking at cost of goods sold is critical. Wages. What are costs? What are cost of labor? What's our profit per labor hour? That's one. If I'm buying a contracting business, I want to know what my profit per labor hour is, because to a large extent we're time in, money out.
Sure.
So in that kind of scenario, it makes a lot of sense for us to say, okay, what's that ratio and has it changed over time? That's why when we get P&Ls, when we do valuations, we look at 5 years. Of P&Ls.
Of past P&Ls.
We do.
Okay.
And we want to, we're looking at year end, but if we see a big fluctuation, I'm going to personally, our valuation specialist probably won't get into that specific of a detail on each one, but I may see something, and having my experience in the industry, I might say, you know what, that doesn't make sense. Why is February and March like just blown up for that for that HVAC contractor? I know historically those are a little slower months, or can be. So I want to dig into it. What did they do different or better? Well, if that was because they may or may not know that that's really great for them. And we're going to see those averages. But it's really important to be able to look at those over time, but month to month as well.
So let me ask this, right? I mean, there's the P&L from the accounting perspective, which you get out of QuickBooks or whatever program you're using, and then there's the P&L from the cash flow perspective, right? Because things like any loan payments, principals that you paid on loan payments, that doesn't show up on the P&L.
Correct.
Right. So if I take that into account, is that a better look at it? Is that worthwhile, or?
It's important, but you're going to look at that on your balance sheet. That's why you have to understand the connectivity between the interconnectivity between your P&L and your balance sheet. If you don't have an understanding of how how they affect each other, just like your cash flow statement and your profit and loss, if you don't understand how those marry together, that's something that you really want to learn in fairly short order, because those can be very immediate telling. Those can be immediate tells to what's happening in your business from a it could be from a cost of goods perspective, where all of a sudden you see that ratio jump up. Well, okay, what happened? The furnaces didn't cost anymore, or they
do now.
Well, they do now, or the electrical panels, but maybe they're not getting you on the furnaces, but they're getting you on everything else. Or not to say that that's the case, but those are the kind of things you want to be able to look at between your cash flow and your profit and loss statement, because your cash flow statement is it's valuable. It's valuable to understand.
Sure. Well, and that whole idea that I had a $35,000 net profit this month, but I don't have any money. But I look at it, my the liabilities went down $40,000 because we ended up with a bunch of that kind of thing.
Yep.
Okay. Let's. What about the balance sheet? I mean, first off, on itself, right? There's one of the areas. Number one, they need to understand what the balance sheet is telling them. Right.
Yeah, you have to understand that your balance sheet is kind of a snapshot in. It's like your. How to explain this? Your balance sheet has to be accurate and it has to change. You have to manage that accurately as well. For instance, we talked about retained earnings earlier. That's a consideration. If you're taking money out of your business and you're buying something, a truck of whatever, a home, a lake home, and there's ways to go about doing that. If you're doing that and your retained earnings are still who really owns that house?
Well,
as we talked
right,
about.
and that was the case. Really, if we're taking that money out, technically you're taking a distribution
Correct.
out of the company, and then that should show up in distributions, and the two offset each other.
Right.
But that scenario you just brought up with, I've dealt with that one where they were transitioning the company. They're looking at their financials and get to the end of it, and we see all this money in retained earnings, and we're going, okay, do you have any cash around? They go, well, not really. Well, it turned out they took all the cash, didn't report it as distributions, but bought the lake house. Now my question is, who owns the lake house? Because
exactly.
that is going to come out in the due diligence with the new buyer.
100%.
Even if it's somebody inside the company, right? We do evaluation of the company.
Correct.
That's going to show up pretty quick, right? So part of that is keep your books clean. Make sure you're current, keep them clean, keep them up to date, right? And understand what they're telling you. Then of course payables and receivables. Something you look at there.
We'll look at days to pay. That can be telling of the health of a company. So we'll look at days to pay. How many are outside of 30 days as far as receivables? That's important too. If you're really lousy at collecting money, you're either working with the wrong people or you are absent of process and nobody's paying attention.
Right.
We all know sometimes there's folks out there that they'll pay you, but not after the first invoice.
Right.
I've had situations in the past where I've sent an invoice and then sent one 2 days later because I know the first one isn't going to get anything, but when they see the second one that says second notice in red on the outside of the envelope, boop, light bulb goes off. We got to pay this. So we look at it, but it's more in terms from our standpoint is the health of the business.
Right. And again, when it comes to receivables, closer you keep that to zero, right? So are you financing? You should be offering financing. You get paid for that right away on service calls, collect at the end of the call immediately, those kinds of things.
Time value of money.
Yeah,
it's critical.
Absolutely. So this idea of the Hill and Valley account, right? So Hill and Valley really technically is part of retained earnings.
Right.
Right. But having a conscious, is there value in this piece in terms of the transition of the company where I as an owner make an intentional effort of putting money aside for those rainy days, for those months that are slow, that we can't maintain cash flow, right? We didn't make money this month, but we still got to pay the bills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having, it's again, a structure for growth. It's a process that you're following. And being able to withstand the storms of any business cycle throughout the year is critical because if you're leveled out, we know in HVAC, February and March, was it September, October, a little bit slower, got to do all our cleaning checks and get all that good stuff. When you're looking at that, to the extent that you can level things out across the board, it really does make you look more solvent.
Sure. Absolutely. Because again, it just helps the cash of the company. And then of course, if you do that, your cash flow statement's going to look better. Everything else kind of falls in line as well. So, again, a lot of stuff to chew on. It's a big topic to cover an hour.
It is.
Right? I get that. But again, more than anything, right, know your numbers, right? Get a solid understanding of where the financials are when you get to that point. Again, this next chapter webinar series is brought to you by Contractor Academy. Now, one of the items that's in here is specifically targeting this area is a training program that we have called the monthly financial review. And every single month you need to be reviewing your financials. And this again is an awesome thing to do with two generations, right? The current leader should be doing this with the next up and coming leader because so we both understand what that is. And really that monthly financial review is looking at your P&L, looking at your balance sheet, your payables, receivables, are we doing a Hill and Valley account, that kind of thing, and looking through that. Now, again, if you don't understand what they're telling you, it makes it a little bit tough to do. The other thing I hear is that, I don't have time to do that. It's not a long process. I mean, literally, the monthly financial review, you can run through that for most companies in about 30 to 40 minutes, right? But if you do it every month, it starts to tell you a story about your company that you won't see otherwise. And so one of the programs in Contractor Academy is that Money Matters course, right? And so Money Matters, the monthly financial review, walks through that process. It's 6 separate lessons. Each one focuses on a different area of the financial review. Stacy's got another document that she'll share because again, when we look at the entire self-paced library that's there, there's something like 55 hours of training if you wanted to sit down and take advantage of all of it. And so what we've done is we've been getting questions, so we put together the document that shows, okay, in each of those action steps, is there a self-paced program that would help me in that area? And so that will kind of point you down to that one. And again, we've got, for as little as $29 a month, you can have access to everything in the library itself. There's multiple levels. You can sign up not only for just yourself, but you can actually sign up for your team and get some price breaks as you go there at the various levels. So take advantage of that. Find it out on grandyassociates.com and jump in there. Now, real quick, the next one, right? So we're already set. We've already queued up for the next program. It's April 21st, and I've got 2 to 3. I need to stand corrected. It's 2:30 to 3:30. Is when we're doing that program. Again, we just got to make sure that we have the resources in the studio here available. So again, between 2:30 and 3:30, we'll give you a link to that on the follow-up email. And the entire focus of that one, Glenn, you're kind of the star of that show, without a question of a doubt, is the business valuation. And so that's a bit of a process, isn't it?
It is, and we'll talk about the different methods of valuation and the things that can affect value. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about when timing for evaluation, when it's appropriate, and how often to redo evaluation. When should we recast the financials and really focus on that?
Yeah, and that's important. So certainly stay tuned for that one. If you have any questions for either one of us, you can reach us, myself here at Grandy Associates, Bill Kennard at Grandy Associates. You've got our number. Glenn, is this the best place to reach you?
You can reach me at gherman@cbs-global.com, or you can reach me at the number stated on the screen at 920-432-1166. Be sure to ask for Glenn Herman.
Yeah, and that's important, right? Because there's a lot of people at CBS, right? And you kind of specialize and focus in this area as well.
I have 10 colleagues. All of us are more than capable of working in almost any industry, but I do focus on working with contractors.
Yep, and Glenn's a great guy, let me tell you. And he dresses dapper.
Yeah.
What can I say? Right? Hey, with that, we're going to bring this episode to a close. We appreciate your being here. Again, if you've been in the live session, we will be sending out an email to you with the link for the recording of this one, so you can go back and view it again and again. With that, hey, make a decision to make it a profitable day.